Dan Gainor currently runs the Business and Cultural Institute at the MRC, but has also been the T. Boone Pickens Fellow as well as the Director of the Free Market Project in the past for the MRC. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dave. It's a pleasure.
First of all, can you tell us what the Media Research Center's primary mission is?
Well, we're a conservative media watchdog, and it's our job to both identify and then neutralize left-wing bias in the media. We've been around for more than 28 years, and we are probably the largest archive you're going to find this side of the Library of Congress for video. We've got, I think the last number is close to 600,000 hours of video.
Wow.
And that means that we're monitoring ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, and not just for news, but also for entertainment. Because one of the things we found over the years is that the bias in the media is in all aspects of media. And you'll see that, you'll see it attacks on conservative issues, you'll see it attacks on businessmen, you'll see it TV shows where they're always targeting businessmen as villains, and the free market system in our country as somehow evil. But one of the things we've learned over time is that essentially the American public has lost faith in the media, and there's good reason for that.
Okay, all right, fair enough. That's a great explanation for our viewers. You know, why do we need a media watchdog? I mean, why can't the media?
I spent decades in news. Yeah, I spent decades in news before I came into this job, and I can tell you that on every major issue of the day, journalists have opinions that they let creep into their news copy. That's who they're friends with, who they socialize with, how they vote. That all creeps in. And it ends up undercutting people's opinion. If you look at the opinions going year by year, using the Pew Center for people in the press, the opinions of the major media have been pretty much on a steady decline for years. And the reason for that is people now have a better sense of what's going on in their media. They turn on TV, they can then watch it in Twitter, watch it on Facebook, and then get real-time reaction. And when they do that, they realize just how disastrous what they're being fed really is. And the net result is, who watches the watchers?
Right. Good question. That's absolutely correct. And obviously, you're one of the people that help us with that, and we're grateful for that. Let's point the conversation now to the interested parties that are associated with many of the shows that are considered financial shows or even financial news shows, where I'm not sure the American public realizes that, unlike the internet, everything on TV is paid for by one group or another. Can we talk about that for a moment?
Oh yeah, sure. And I mean, when you get into niche markets, financial shows, sports shows, that's where really, I guess you would say, some of the worst media cronyism is. Because, I mean, it's in your best interest to not alienate the very people who are paying your salary, and then you get so that crops up when you've got an ABC evening news show, and you're touching on a lot of different topics. You're going to run less maybe into advertisers, but if you are talking about something happening in the business media, then you're really running into a much more narrow market where financial advisors, mutual funds, everybody involved, they've all got a piece of the pie, and you're expecting whoever you're watching to be a neutral observer. They're not.
Yeah. So who else beside financial advisors, mutual fund families, are the advertisers in these types of shows that might influence the decision of a reporter or someone else?
Well, I mean, I think even before you get into that, you got to think also about corporate ownership. It's a very finite number of organizations that own media. So you're looking at, just use it, NBC for example. NBC is MSNBC, is CNBC with corporate owners, ultimately Comcast. are you going to really, and then so that means they're extremely reliant on cable. A couple of those shows, a couple of those networks wouldn't survive at all without cable. And then, of course, they're owned by cable. So are you going to expect them to be, have their advisors, their analysts come on and talk about cable and say, oh yeah, we think the future of cable is bad? No, of course not, because they're too closely tied to that market. So then you go into start looking at advertisers, and it's the whole universe of financial media, financial advisors, financial mutual funds, stock market, from soup to nuts. And so and you can even listen in. You can, when you're watching a show, sometimes you'll hear, oh, we just recommended this stock, and 2 minutes later you're hearing an advertisement for a company that's related to that company.
Yeah, so you wonder why, and then all of a sudden you look back later and you think, oh, I get it. It makes sense. Yeah, it's so true, and I want to talk more.
It doesn't necessarily mean that they're compromised. It just means that you've got to really take a John Desai at it all.
And of course, with any publicly traded company, if the advertiser is publicly traded, their number one fiduciary responsibility is to their shareholders. And it's very easy for a reporter writing an article or doing a news report to get influenced by what they say. And right after the break, we're to talk more about that. We're here now with Dan Gainor, talking about some of the issues that we have to deal with in the news reporting world, in this field, and how some of the things that you hear and read about financial advice and so on could be skewed more toward the profit motives of a particular person, and maybe just a little bit less toward what's truly in your best interest. We'll be right back with Dan Gainor. We're here today with Dan Gainor, and we're having a frank conversation about how reporting, specifically financial reporting, be it through published media or through television, is influenced by the likes of advertisers and other interested parties. Dan, you're talking about the advertisers per se, so it sounds like you're saying if an advertiser for a particular show, for example, is a mutual fund family, then it's likely that you're going to hear a lot of positive things about mutual funds, for example. Is that correct?
Well, or if nothing else, you won't hear the negative. I mean, that's just the reality. I mean, everybody has to pay the bills, and so if a particular show is funded entirely by mutual funds, you're not going to hear that show is saying, "Oh, well, mutual funds are a bad bet," because advertisers will flee. If you watch the evening news shows, you don't see a lot of stories, generally speaking, attacking the whole drug industry. Evening news shows are funded. There are a lot of advertisers that are drug manufacturers. It's just not one of the things that they crusade against. So when you're looking at, when you get to the basics, really it helps to understand how you kind of make the secret sauce that is journalism. And while the economy started doing a downturn in the last several years, with 2007, journalism never really stopped. And as a result, you've seen massive decline in number of working journalists in major cities. We've lost a lot of major dailies. There's a lot fewer people reporting there, and then there's a lot of pickup of what other people do. So I mean, all it takes is one bad story sometimes, and the next thing you know, that bad story is spread like a virus across the internet. Yeah. And so because journalists are not spending a lot of research time double checking it, you really have to be well informed. And to give you an example how bad this can really be, you're not going to get the most advanced knowledge from journalists. Several years ago, I'm a member of Society of Professional Journalists, which is not mandatory, but it's a good organization. And I took economist Brian Westbury, a great guy, took him to an annual conference, and we had a meeting talking about how to teach economics to journalists. And there's about 26, 27 journalists in the room, and Brian got it that by speaking to that small a number, he was speaking to hundreds of thousands or millions of people. And so the first question he asked, he says, how many of you have had advanced training in business or economics? One person raised a hand. And he just went off. I mean, he's a very nice guy, but he was just stunned by how embarrassingly bad this was. And he said, how are you supposed to cover business and economics if only one of you had any training in it?
And Dan, isn't it
That's
true?
what they do. So it's easy to pull the wool over the eyes of.
Dan, isn't it also true
easy
that
to pull the wool over their eyes?
Isn't it true also that a lot of times writers, to gain experience, might write about sports for a while and then write about something else and then maybe fall into finance? Is that a big part of the reason why perhaps that they're not experts in that particular area as most readers would think?
Well, I mean, most journalists are generalists. I mean, you're not, maybe when you get to the Wall Street Journal level, you're not talking about that. But, there are people, journalism is a trade, not a profession like medicine where everybody necessarily went through years of study. A lot of journalists didn't get a journalism degree. And even then, a journalism degree is how to do journalism, not how to do economics, not a study of business. And frankly, when you kind of scratch the surface of most journalists, they're not business friendly. I've always joked, when you go to work at a news organization, the news organization isn't even friendly with its own business department. The people, they don't like the advertising and circulation people, the people who help pay their bills. The only time they talk to them is at the Christmas party. So to expect them to turn around and be friendly to your business, it's just not going to happen.
Right, right. In the 2 minutes or so we have left, Dan, can you share with our viewers some egregious examples, or at least one egregious example of in the financial industry that you can recall?
One of the worst examples, and I mean, this is foundational to the economic collapse of 2007, 2008, is the Fannie Mae Freddie Mac scandal.
Sure.
For years, Wall Street Journal led the charge saying that this was an organization, an operation that was destined for chaos, and the American public would be on the hook for billions and billions of dollars. Mm-hmm. New York Times picked up on it, much to their credit. Washington Post picked up, much to their credit. And there was almost complete and utter silence on ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, to the point where Charlie Gasparino, who I remember him coming out at the time, and he was railing on the networks and saying that the reason why they're not talking about this is bias. But here's the reason why. Because the journalists were convinced that Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac helped ordinary, particularly poor and underprivileged people get mortgages. So they would go to talk to their buddies on the Hill who invariably were pro Freddie Mae and Freddie Mac, and they're telling them, oh, there's nothing wrong. So it ends up being this enormous disaster, costing taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars. And only when everything really hit the fan did the networks even at all attempt to cover it.
Yeah. And anyone who owned Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac stock back then actually knows what's happened to that. There's been a huge loss of wealth for shareholders. So you're absolutely correct. Yeah,
and I mean where's the responsibility for that? If you're an investor and you rely on the regular media to tell you what's going on, then you're just a dazzling fool.
I love it, a dazzling fool. All right, well. So for our viewers, obviously, you don't want Dan Gainor to refer to you as a dazzling fool. So pay attention to different sources. And as I always say, always ask the question, why? Why is it something's being touted for us? Marty Johnson's going to be here in just a minute and actually talking about that as part of her report. So Dan, I want to take this moment to thank you very much for being part of our show today, as usual.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Okay. And we'll be right back in just a minute with Marty. Stay tuned.